welcome to our guest, Andy Muir, and our sponsor, which is Beatles Magazine. Beatles Magazine is a publication with 200 million visitors and all their pages, read by thousands of fans around the world every day. The most complete online coverage, Beatles news updated 24 hours, audio, video, photos, additional materials, and more. Join us 24 hours a day, 8 days a week, as the Beatles would sing on the web. They're on Facebook, Twitter, and Google. That's Beatles Magazine. And we'd like to say welcome to one of the premier Dylan writers, and that's Mr. Andy Muir, who's joining us over from England. Good evening, Andy.
Yeah, good evening. Thanks for having me on your show, Bob.
Well, you know, we like to do things backwards here, so I'm going to ask you straight up. Could you tell us about your website, books, and where we can find your information about Bob? I know three of my favorite books. The one, I think you just released Troubadour again. Can you tell us where they can find your stuff and what's new in the world of Andy Muir?
Yeah, well, I should be able to do backwards. I'm called it often enough. The best way to say about all the books and magazines, if I give one web address, you can actually get everything from there. So this is the web address. It's www.a-muir, that's muir.co.uk. www.a-muir.co.uk. It's just a kind of screen with lots of links on it. It's got lots of free stuff as well as books you can order, and from there you can get to virtually everything I've ever done, really.
Well, three of the books, just to mention, Troubadour, One More Night, and Razor's Edge are all by Andy Muir, and they'd be available at that address. And also, I'd like to ask, how did you get started with Homer the Slut and Judas? Not a question I ask every guest.
No. Well, they're both Dylan fanzines. The first one was a homemade fanzine that I ran between 1990 and 1995, approximately. I say homemade, what I mean is, I typed it up myself and I photocopied it. The second one, Judas, was more like a literary quarterly, and it had a professional publisher, etc. The reason I first started it is I'd always wanted to write a magazine on Dylan. I'd always liked writing on things. When I was a teenager, I was really into science fiction, and I used to run a science fiction magazine. Curiously enough, I got in touch with Paul Williams about that. Paul Williams, the great Dylan writer, but we didn't talk about Dylan then. It was years later that we came together on Dylan. So I always liked writing magazines. When computers came out, there was a way of doing it, so I just did one and sent it out.
And if people wanted to look up the archive of some of those today, from the older ones, are they still available?
Yeah, that address I gave, www.a-muir.co.uk, along the bottom of it, it's got links, including one to Homer the Slut, and indeed one to Judas. All of the Homer the Sluts are up there, and it's thanks to an old subscriber. I don't mean he's an old person, I mean he's a subscriber from the old days, called Andrew Steed, who, when I was thinking of trying to put it up on the website, offered to and then scanned all of them in, which was really quite remarkable of him. So they're all up there. Nearly all of the Judases are up there. There's 3 missing issues out of 20, and I'll get them up there one day, and they're all free to download.
Now here's a little curveball. That's an American expression from the baseball vernacular. Did Bob Dylan ever sign one of those fanzines?
Well, Bob Dylan did, yes, he did indeed. He signed issue 9 of Homer the Slut. I met him in Camden when he was doing the promo video for Blood in My Eyes. And he was reading Homer the Slut, and Dave Stewart was filming him, and they were trying to get him out because a crowd was gathering. So I said to him that he could keep one. I had 2 with me. I was holding one, and he was reading the other one. So I had one for him to sign, which he did, and then he took the other one away with him. So
you read him.
Yeah, well, I don't know if you read him. He was sitting reading it, and they were trying to move him. And of course, fanzines being fanzines, not everybody writes nice things, So I was a little bit worried about some things he would be reading. And in the inside cover, there was an advert for my home telephone number, which was a Dylan information line at the time. And he said he was going to ring it up and see what I had to say about him. He said it kind of threateningly, but I just laughed.
Is that framed today? Like, is that in the Muir family vault? Or?
It's in a vault. Well, it's actually a drawer that's got very rare things in it, like the 1966 Playboy. I get Playboy for Bob Dylan interviews, obviously, before you jump to the wrong conclusions there.
Well, I buy all the other ones that don't have Bob Dylan in them.
Well, I had to buy loads and loads of rare magazines with Dylan in them just to cover up the fact that's what I bought it for, you know. But no, it's in there with a letter from David Attenborough and other things like that, you know.
I'm with you. Now I have to ask, when were you like struck first by Bob Dylan? When did it hit you that this man's art is far above and beyond? When did you become enamored with Bob Dylan?
Well, it would be almost, I could almost tell you the month, because it was about 2 months before Blood on the Tracks came out, so it would be about November '74. But before that, I had a number of false starts, because just when I was getting into music, Bob was in a bit of retirement, and I mean, you know, doing the country stuff, etc., and quite a long period without an album. And by the time I sort of got curious about him, I kept hearing references to him. I had the Who's Meaty Beaty Big and Bouncy, and in the Seeker, Pete Townsend was searching for Bob Dylan. I'd really been into Elton John's Tumbleweed Connection. It's probably the second or third album that I got into. And I saw a big headline in Melody Maker, it's a music paper over here, big headline saying, Dylan digs Elton. And clearly they thought that because Bob Dylan liked him, this was the ultimate seal of approval. And I kept hearing these references, so I went to the local library. I didn't have enough money to buy a record then, so I went to the local library and they had Self-Portrait, so I got that out. And I listened to it, and I mean, I enjoyed it, you know, I enjoyed it well enough. I really liked Belle Isle and the sort of Western songs. But I didn't really get what I was expecting, because I'd been told it was this revolutionary writer with these unbelievable lyrics that would just blow your mind, and Self-Portrait didn't really blow my mind. So that left me there, and then my sister had a new boyfriend. Turned out to be a temporary boyfriend, but he came, and to impress him, I said, you know, trying to be really cool when I was about 13 or 14, trying to be really cool, I said, I'm listening to Bob Dylan. He said, what are you listening to? I said, Self-Portrait. He said, oh, that's not good, you have to get his early stuff. So I thought, okay, I've got the wrong thing, I'll go and buy a record. So I went into a record shop, and the prices had just gone up, and I'd saved my pocket money to have enough for a record, but I couldn't afford the new one. So I got one on a bargain basement bin with, you know, about 50 pence off or something, and it was Nashville Skyline. So I quite liked that, but again, there wasn't this explosion, you know, of revolutionary poetry and all this. So this story, you know, it goes on the same way. I went back to the library, took back Self-Portrait, and got out Dylan, the outtakes of Self-Portrait. So that didn't really help much either. Then my next album was Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid, soundtrack to a movie. So, you know, Knocked on Heaven's Door was great, and I liked Billy, but I didn't really get the revolutionary stuff. Hey, Bob, I'm not answering your question at all, am I? The penny hasn't dropped yet.
It's very interesting, and I'm glad you said that, because it's, you know, like, it's just the one time I wrote something about Self-Portrait that got me in a lot of trouble, but it's funny you're mentioning the ones that they're like at the bottom of the list I would want to listen to, and it just amazes me that those are the ones that came to you first. As much as I love Dylan, and I know some fans are going to be mad at me just for saying that, like there's still worthy stuff on those releases. But, okay, so you listen to those and there's such a reputation, you're still willing to listen again after those. So which one grabbed you? Which one did you come up to? Wow.
Well, what happened was my mum had gone to university as a mature student, as we kindly call old people here, mature. And she'd said to somebody in her class, you know, that I was listening to Dylan, and he lent her an album. Now, we had a strange legal situation over here, where in Italy and Germany they had albums that were legal in those countries, but not in the rest of Europe, and we would call them bootlegs. But they were actually legal in Italy, and he'd been on holiday to Italy and he'd got some of them. They were called A Rare Batch of Little White Wonder. And he lent one to me, and on one side it had early acoustic stuff, Lay Down Your Weary Tune, Dusty Old Fairgrounds, and on the other side it had the band sessions from '65, starting with Can You Please Crawl Out Your Window, and that was it. Nothing has ever been the same in my life since then, you know, and it was the voice before the lyrics. You know, I've written a lot in Dylan's lyrics, but I knew that the songs were really profound before I could understand any of them, because the voice just let me know. And the other great thing was, because I'd grown up in the 70s and not the 60s, I had no split between acoustic and electric. It just, to me, was all Dylan. It was later on I found out, you know, it was different sides. But to me, it was all just the same man. And that was it. His voice hooked me, and then the words pulled me in, and, well, it's been like that ever since.
Now, within that, another question comes to my mind because I believe, like I've read in some of your things, you had mentioned about Dylan being a great singer, and I think he is. But most people would say, this guy's a wonderful songwriter, a wonderful lyricist. If someone asked you why you find him a very talented singer, what is it about his singing and his ability with presenting the lyrics that you find to put him in a very high category as a vocalist?
Well, that's a good question. I think it's because he communicates so much more than, let's say, a pitch-perfect singer singing a song the same way every time would do. So that. I'm cheating slightly there because I've already brought in that Dylan changes it every time he sings. But even within singing a song, the same line in the chorus, he never sings it the same way twice. He plays off it slightly. And he brings such feeling to the way he's singing. He totally inhabits the person whose point of view he's singing from. If you listen to North Country Blues, and he sounds like this woman whose family have left and is desolate. He puts himself in her position, which is one thing. But on a more technical level, obviously, I think his phrasing is just unbelievably good, and I think that's possibly the most important thing. His phrasing's extraordinary. But he also, each word he sings, he fills with the meaning of the word. So if you're listening to something like, well, let's say Farewell Angelina, which we waited years and years to hear, and when you suddenly hear it and he sings, flutters with fear, his voice flutters with fear as he says it. And when he sings Flooded Over, he actually sings the word flood as though his mouth is flooding. It's extraordinary. And that's the way all the way through his career he can really inhabit something and make you feel it. I do realise, by the way, that lots of people hate Dylan's voice. I once gave a talk at Strathclyde University, and it was a long talk. It was over an hour and a half, so I put lots of music in, and I got a local Scottish singer called Sandy Watson. He came in and played a lot of songs, because I knew that if I played Dylan, they'd just not like it. So I played one Dylan song, and it was the one time in the hour and a half that the audience stopped paying attention, and they all just started chatting to each other. The minute Dylan's voice came on, they turned off. It was really sad.
Well, it's funny that, it still is striking me that the first albums you got were the ones that would be the ones that I would come to last. I'm still glad I own them and I've heard them. But that was such an interesting take to me that those came to you first. When I first bought Nashville Skyline, I was about 15, and long story short, but I went to the record store and came home with the vinyl record and put it on, and I wasn't familiar with the background to it. And when I put it on, I thought that they put the wrong record in the sleeve, and I thought I got like a Buck Owens album or something, not really Buck Owens, but a country album. Like, when he was doing things like that with his voice, just because you had mentioned that, I'm curious, what do you think led him suddenly to change and do a country album like that at that time?
I mean, his voice, that's the thing when people just, another thing about that, when people say they don't like Dylan's voice, it drives me mad, because it makes it sound like he's only got one voice. And you take the voice of The Times They Are A-Changin' and the voice of Lay Lady Lay, and it's completely different voices. Yeah, and of course, Visions of Johanna in between them, just to pick three from the 60s. It's like three different voices completely. Although they're all Dylan's voice as well, which is another interesting thing. But when people say they can't take his voice, I feel like saying, have you listened to I Threw It All Away or something? Why did he want to do it? Well, he'd moved from genre to genre. He'd moved from folk to obviously to rock, and then to country. I think partly it's just the artist not wanting to be pinned down to one thing and to change his way. I think after the 66 tour and the explosion of, the Summer of Love following on from Blonde and Blonde, where everybody was trying to top it, or that's how it seems to me, I don't think Dylan liked the way that had gone at all, and I think he wanted to go back to more traditional music. Possibly always an interest in country music. Obviously, he'd always loved Hank Williams and Johnny Cash. So the interests were there. And if you look throughout his whole career, he's explored every facet. I mean, it wasn't long after that country that, with Self-Portrait, he was looking at music with string backing. That didn't come out until the bootleg series. But he was already looking at that different genre. And, at the moment he's singing Frank Sinatra. So he's gone through genres all the time. And the great thing about him is he's always 100% or 0%. So when he changes for something, he goes the whole way. He doesn't just play at it, So when he went electric, he started making disparaging remarks about his earlier folk songs. And when he went country all the way.
As I was reading through Troubadour again before we spoke tonight, something jumped out at me, and I found it interesting, and that was before he had this country phase, Nashville Skyline. You had mentioned in Troubadour that there really was a bridge to that, in that he was doing the basement tapes, but they weren't released until 1974, I believe, although recorded in 67, I think. And so that was really kind of a bridge that led to Nashville Skyline. Do you want to just, I thought it was real interesting the way you wrote about that in your book Troubadour, and I thought maybe you could just, speak a little about what you wrote on that.
Yeah, well, I mean, after the fabled motorcycle crash, the Dylan's so-called retirement was actually, I think Clinton Halen points out, he wrote more songs in the year after that than at any other time in his career. There was an extraordinary output because he did the basement tapes, as you say, and they were eventually released in a double album that was not very representative of what had gone down. And also didn't cover anything like the range. There was an absolutely huge amount of material, new covers, all kinds of stuff, exploring the whole gamut of the American songbook, if you want. All the old folk songs that he was returning to. It was only 1967, so it's incredible that he'd done such a lot in such a short space of time. The 18 months bringing it all back home, Highway 61 and Blonde on Blonde, are so massive. It's like a mountain peak in the middle of the 60s. It wasn't actually that long in a time span. And then he was back to singing folk music. But the link, if you want, the bridge, although it was that in a way, the bridge was really John Wesley Hardin, because John Wesley Hardin, and just showing you how prolific Dylan was at the time, he was doing this wonderful collection of material called the Basement Tapes, and he didn't put that out, but he then recorded a whole album, and I think one of his best 5 albums. You can probably guess my top 4, but it's been my 5th favourite album since the first day I heard it. I think it's an absolute masterpiece. But the last 2 songs on it clearly point the way to country. So if you follow the album through, you end with 2 country songs at the end. You got Down Along the Cove, and Tonight I'll Be Staying Here with You.
Now, in that time period, Dylan, you mentioned the motorcycle crash and such. And if I was just studying Dylan at that point in time, or just, when I was just becoming familiar with what I have learned about Dylan, whatever that's worth. But at that time, I would wonder if he was ever going to tour again. And I know, you've written so much about the quote-unquote never-ending tour. It's such a contrast in my mind that at that point, he seems to me like Dylan the Hermit. And I'm wondering if this guy would ever want to go on the road again. And then he wound up doing, I think a couple of thousand shows at a point in time I never would have expected that. Do you want to just talk about your own thoughts about that a little and tell us about your book on the Never Ending Tour?
Okay, I will do, but can we do an edit here, because I made a mistake a minute ago. I said the album ended with Down Along the Cove and Tonight I'll Be Staying Here with You. It actually ends with Down Along the Cove and I'll Be Your Baby Tonight. Is there a way of getting that back in, Josh?
Actually sounded good the way you just covered right there. I mean, I don't really think you need to edit it. It sounded great.
Okay.
No, it sounded good. Keep going. You guys sound awesome.
Okay.
I'm just kidding back. I'm enjoying learning all this classic rock music history, and I had a couple of Dylan questions for you when...
Okay, it was just a mistake. It was I'll Be Your Baby Tonight. So sorry, the Never-Ending Tour.
Okay.
Being surprised that I've forgotten the question. Sorry, being surprised that he started it, or
it's just in the late '60s. I would wonder if the fellow was ever going to tour again after that motorcycle.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And of course, it was much worse for us over in Europe because we didn't get him till 1978. You got him in '74, the great so-called comeback tour, and then you had the wonderful Rolling Thunder in '75, '76. But over here in Europe, we'd seen him in the Isle of Wight, one show in full country mode, 1 hour, and that was it since '66. And given the fact he'd been booed so much in '66, you couldn't really blame him. But we really wondered if we'd ever see him again. So when he arrived here in '78, it was a really, really, really big thing. So we had Baby Stop Crying in the top 20 with dancers doing it on top of the pops. Street Legal went straight to number 1. It didn't do very well in the States. And I had to queue. I started queuing 3 nights before the tickets went on sale for to see him in London. So it was an absolutely huge thing. And basically, when I went along in '78, I mean, apart from it being the biggest thing in my life ever to actually see him, I thought that would be it. Because he hadn't been since '66. So he came in '78. I thought that would be it. Then he came in '81. Then he came in '84, then he came in '87, so you're beginning to see '78, '81, '84, '87. It's every 3 years. Now, we were ecstatic at that. We thought that was brilliant. We didn't know what was round the corner. We didn't get him in '88 at the beginning of the Never Ending Tour, you did, but then from '89 onwards we've had him time after time, and no, I never saw it coming. I don't think anybody saw it coming. But it's a wonderful thing. As you know, it was a huge thing in my life, and I've written 2 books about it. Bringing it up to 2011, which was a bit annoying for me because the last 2 years I saw him, 2013 and 2015, were probably my favourites in about the last decade. But unfortunately, the book finishes at 2011. Damn it.
Well, one thing I just want to mention, it's a friend of mine, Mike Canfield, passed away, and he, was kind enough to tell me some Dylan anecdotes because he had hung around with him. And, most of the stuff I keep private and we're told privately, but one I think it's okay to tell was he just said he was talking to Dylan, and Dylan just said to him, as a friend, he just said, man, all I want to do is play. And that was before the Never Ending Tour started by a few years, and I just bring it up just because I wanted a chance to mention Mike Canfield. And he was such a nice person and an author in his own right, and he just related that to me, and it touched me. He said, like Dylan said, no matter what, night after night, I just want to be playing. And I thought of that quote where he said, I realized I could be a greeter at the Hard Rock Cafe. And he's sure gone a long way, in his comeback now with all these #1 albums and the current tours and things. And that leads me into my next thought that I have to ask you about. Because, Andy makes one little, grammatical mistake, and he's correcting himself and worried. That's because he's such an expert on this subject. And I wish I had half of his knowledge, but I want to ask him about this Nobel Prize business. What's going on with this Nobel Prize?
Well, just before that, it's an interesting thing your friend Mike said, actually, because there's the big thing about Dylan deciding on the Never Ending Tour when he was out with the Grateful Dead and he'd lost all connection, and he had an epiphany and decided that he had to stand and he had to tour. That's what he had to do, and Dylan, is very clear in his memory of it, not that you can hear it in the tape of the show, but Dylan's very clear in his memory that he decided at that moment. But it is interesting that your friend says, before that he was saying he just wanted to get out and play, because I was reading something today set in the time when, round about 1970 again, set in the time when he wasn't touring, and he was talking to somebody and they were talking about music, and he was working out how it would work in a live set. The song they were talking about. And what's really interesting about that is in the middle of his so-called retirement, he was still thinking about how would this work live. So, it's interesting that he sees himself as that player all the time. But the Nobel thing, well, that's it's been a heck of a last few weeks, hasn't it? So if we maybe take this in stages. First of all, him getting it, then his long silence, and then what he said after his long silence. Because you may have forgotten after all the fuss about the silence, but there was quite a big fuss when he got it. Mainly a matter of definition, because it's actually called, as you know, the Nobel Prize for Literature. So there's a big argument about whether what Dylan does is literature or not. I want to say right away that I think his work is more than worthy of it. I've been sort of campaigning for this most of my adult life. And I've extolled his lyrics in universities and was scorned back in the 1970s when I was doing so. So I'm very happy for it. But I do understand why some people get a little bit, not so happy with the definition. And some of the arguments in the newspapers I think are a little bit silly, because some people are defining literature in a very narrow way and some in a very wide way. And if you define it in a narrow way, it is about written words. And all the stuff about Homer and oral poetry and the poetry of the past doesn't really come into that, because that's pre-literate. Okay, we read Homer because it's now written down, but when people are saying it used to be sung, well, that was the whole point. It was pre-literate. Doesn't mean it's worth any less, of course, if it's oral rather than written. It's just that it's a different category, and that's why some people were against it. If, on the other hand, you think of literature in a wider term, as a term of meaning poet, or because you could have oral poet and written poet, obviously, or artist, or art, then obviously Dylan fits and lots of other people fit. So that's why I think sometimes, if people would just define what they mean at the beginning, we could get why they're for or against something. But anyway, I think he's very much worth it. I have a worry about it, and my worry about it is that when you define Dylan as literature, you're concentrating on his words, which of course I think are magnificent. But if you remember, I said the first thing that hit me as profound was his voice and his playing. And if you define him as literature and study him on the page, you lose that. Now, to me, there's not that much Dylan on the page that moves me anything, very little in fact, that moves me anything like hear him play it. And I mean him play it. There are some great cover versions, but pretty few really. And none of them, I would say, give you the depth of hearing Dylan do it. So for me, you actually have to hear Dylan play the songs for them to be as great as they are. And I'll give you an example of why I'm worried. One of my other obsessions, as you probably know, is Shakespeare, who I've also written a book on. And for most of my life, I studied Shakespeare as literature. And it was only the last 15 years or so that I started realising that although he's the greatest poet we've ever had, first and foremost he was a dramatist, and he was a dramatist that wanted bums on seats, and he wanted to play in big halls, and he wanted lots of people to come and see him. I might remind you of somebody else that way. And each night the text, the actual play script of Shakespeare changed. The actors would change it, Shakespeare would change it. Sometimes Hamlet could be 4 hours, sometimes it could be 2 hours. The main thing was the performance. And I didn't know that for about 20 years of studying Shakespeare because I studied him on the page, because that's how I was taught at university. It horrifies me to think 20 years from now somebody might be, as they said when they gave him the prize, reading Blonde on Blonde. I don't want them reading Blonde on Blonde, I want them listening to Blonde on Blonde. So that's my slight worry about it. But of course it's a magnificent thing and it's wonderful. And you might have to wonder why the Nobel Prize people finally picked Dylan this year, and I've read some interesting theories on that. Needless to say, I don't believe any of them because I'm a bit of a skeptic.
Can I interrupt?
Sure, of course.
Just not sure if we lost Josh.
I'm here.
Okay, you know what? It just came up on my screen. I apologize. It came up with a red phone, and I was afraid what Andy was saying was getting cut, so I apologize for that. I just wanted to be sure. Forgive me.
No, we're good. We're still trucking along. We're recording here, so yeah, I'm just listening to what you have to say.
I just wanted to be sure because what he was saying was so prolific, and I didn't want to lose that.
No, absolutely. No, it sounds great. I'm just sitting here listening to you guys, taking it all in. It's like being back in college.
I apologize.
You're fine, Bob. You guys are great. Please keep going.
Well, some people have been writing about reasons why the Nobel Prize has been given, or for literature, has been given to a songwriter or a rock musician or whatever way they describe Dylan. Lots of them still describe him as a folk singer, of course. One of the theories I've read quite a lot is that they've done it because we're now in a multimedia age and the print age is dead, which is quite an interesting idea. And along with that, theories that what they're doing is they're acknowledging that music has replaced novels. And both of these theories have got something going for them. The thing about the print age now being at an end, I think, is a very interesting thing. Nothing, to do with Dylan, just in a very wide scope of society. When the printing presses came along, it changed everything in society. It changed history. It changed absolutely everything. And the fact that we might be moving away from that age is quite a thought to take in. And the idea that music has replaced novels, well, certainly music was the identity for people of my age growing up, etc. But I'm not really buying that the Nobel Prize is doing it now, because if they had thought this, why wouldn't they have given a prize to cinema, say? I mean, radio's been about for over 100 years. TV's been around for, more than half a century. Cinema for a century or more. So they haven't, in all that time, changed the description of literature. So I'm not so sure it's for that. But they're interesting theories. And of course, we didn't know what Dylan thought about it because he was quiet for a while. Did you enjoy when he was quiet, Bob?
I think he's a rip. I mean, I had different thoughts about that as it was happening. One is, I wonder, very hard to figure out, right? Even for people who listen to him a lot. And I wondered, is he doing this on purpose as almost a promotion because Dylan's silence becomes a headline? It's a unique way to respond to it. I don't think that was right. It was just something that ran through my mind. And then I thought that just was his reaction. Like, I think he's, obviously sees things in a different take than 99.9% of us. And I think when you can tell us about what his reaction was, and I think he was sort of telling the truth about it. I'm more interested in what you think about it, but I think he said he was taken aback and didn't know what to say. I don't know if that's totally untrue.
Yeah, I mean, your thing about the promotion, I think, you're not the only one to have thought that. I mean, Dylan has been a master of using the media to his own ends for quite some time. And the headlines, I mean, it was every single day, it was headlines all around the world. But I'm not sure, like you, I think it might just be genuine what he said. What I'd love to do is hear it. I mean, all I've seen is a translation from the Swedish. I'd love to actually hear Dylan's voice, because as you're probably aware, when you read his interview comments, if you don't hear him, you're never quite sure if he's needling somebody or having somebody on. But it was quite funny. I mean, whatever way you take it, whether he meant it or not, after 2 weeks of silence to say, this is what he actually said. He says, the news about the Nobel Prize left me speechless. Which, it's quite funny, really, after 2 weeks of silence, I think. But it wasn't quite 2 weeks, because he'd phoned them on the Tuesday, but still, it was over 10 days. And to say that it left him speechless, I thought was kind of funny. But maybe he just meant it genuinely and not as a sort of joke at the same time. But what I thought was really interesting was they then mentioned to him the bit about the announcer had said, that Homer and Sappho, when you look back to those were poetic texts that were listened to. And Edna Gunderson. Oh, could I just say, by the way, it was good to see Edna Gunderson being the interviewer again. She used to interview Dylan a lot for USA Today, but I'm pretty sure she lost her job there. They had quite savage cuts a couple of years back, so it was nice to see her back with Dylan again. Anyway, she put this to him, and what she said was that Dylan hesitated before answering. And then Dylan lists some of his songs that he says could be considered Homeric. Or, what was he actually said? He said they're definitely Homeric in value. And the songs he picked were Blind Willie McTell, The Ballad of Hollis Brown, A Hard Rain's A Gonna Fall, probably with me all the way here, and then Joey and Hurricane, which I thought were really interesting too. Especially Joey, because the last time I remember him mentioning Joey, he was in some trouble for the lyrics, sort of making a gangster look so good. And if I remember...
Jacques Levy for writing the lyrics.
Yeah, he did, didn't he? He did. He said it was Levy that wrote the lyrics.
Myself.
Yeah, and now he's claiming it's Homeric. But it's really interesting, if you go through the years of Dylan interviews, that one time aside when he pushed it onto Levy, that one time aside, he's often pushed Joey as being a good song. In the 78 and 81 interviews in the British press, he kept mentioning Joey and trying, as one of his favourite songs of his own. So I think it's quite interesting. What interests me about it, and Hurricane to agree, what interests me about it is that, Joey caused a lot of fuss. Lester Bangs wrote a thing really ripping Dylan to shreds for glorifying Joey. And Joey Gallo was, a pretty horrible person, both in and out of prison. And Dylan writes this thing of him, but he writes it as though he's writing about an old character like Robin Hood or Jesse James or Pretty Boy Floyd. It's quite possible Robin Hood wasn't such a nice fellow, but over time he's become this myth. And what Dylan seems to be doing is writing a myth about somebody who's alive. And that, of course, causes all kinds of problems. It's quite fascinating for me, in a 1981 interview where he's defending Joey, he actually mentions Robin Hood. And he also mentions that, and in the sense of Robin Hood was probably morally good no matter what he did. And he indicates that he thinks the same of Joey. And the interviewer kind of pushes him on this, and Dylan says, well, I don't write songs about rapers. The word is rapists, but I'm pretty sure he says rapers. Although I'm getting old, my memory's not to be too trusted, but I think he does. I don't write songs about rapers. Now, in the Lester Bangs attack on Dylan, he actually mentions Joey taking part in a gang rape in prison. So I don't know if Dylan just came up with that word by chance, or if he was deliberately going back at Lester Bangs. Just makes you wonder. But Joey's often been on his mind. And Hurricane, that's another one. Hurricane, I'm presuming, in fact I'm not presuming, we know that Dylan really thought Hurricane was an innocent man in jail, so you can write anything to get him off. But the song, the song takes quite a lot of liberties with the truth. There's the stuff about, he could take a man out with one punch, but he never liked to talk about it that much. And then there's an image of Hurricane by some paradise in the countryside, watching trout in a stream and riding a horse down a trail. Well, the only connection he really had with horses was he used to punch them unconscious with one punch when they were tethered. So he could take a horse out with one punch, and he really did like to talk about it much. But anyway, as far as Dylan was concerned, it was an innocent man in jail, so I guess you can pull any tricks for that. But my point here is the Homeric ones he's picking myths that he made. He made a myth out of Joey, and to an extent, or certainly he seems to be leaning toward making a myth out of Hurricane. Same album, you've got Sarah, beautiful family images in it, but also images making her a myth, Radiant Jewel, Sweet Virgin Angel. So I think there's something in Desire where he was thinking Homeric.
Well, Jacques Levy knew Joey, and I think sometimes I'd just like to add in, if you know someone, you know part of a person, and it's quite possible if he knew him as a friend, he knew a different part. You could know John Gotti or you could know Pretty Boy Floyd and not know the entire person. And I think that song was sort of a myth. I just think with him, so many things are interesting, just as if he's saying, at one point, I didn't write the lyrics to it. After Jacques Levy passed away, he said he wrote the lyrics. And then we know he said he can lie to the media because they ask for it sometimes, so you wonder what really happened. But I think your memory now is on the top 2 or 3 Dylan expositors out there. Today.
I mean, it is remarkable that one interview you're talking about is remarkable because it contradicts all the other interviews. I mean, Jacques Levy himself said that Joey was his idea. I don't think Dylan's ever confirmed or denied that, but he said it was his idea. And by the way, you're right about I'm not saying I'm an expert on Joey Gallo's life, but we do know things that he did that are reprehensible. But when he was in prison, he read a lot, as Dylan says, and he read a tremendous amount more than even Dylan lists in the song. And when he came out, he did circulate in society with people like Neil Simon, etc. He went to their parties, so Jacques Levy would have met him and perhaps was charmed by him. Certainly lots of other people were. But just the idea of myth is what I was after for the Homeric, because what is really, really interesting about the Dylan quote is he doesn't put in Roll on John. And Roll on John has half a dozen lines taken straight from Homer's Odyssey, word for word.
Okay, I'm just going to straight up, rather than try to sound like I pretend I know everything, which people would know, I don't. I did not know that. Could you expound on that a bit? I didn't know he took the song from that.
No, he didn't take the song. He didn't take the song from this. There's lots of different things in the song, but there's 6 lines that come from one particular translation of Homer's Odyssey. But I'm not taking credit for this myself. I think I noticed one of them at the time. And I think I was talking to John Stokes at the time. But the man who's right on the top of this is a guy called Scott Warmuth. I'm pronouncing that wrongly. Apologies. It's Warmuth. And Scott collects all the references to Dylan. People send them to him because Scott does so much of it himself. And so on he's got a Pinterest board, and he'll have all of them there. But they're very direct. I mean, I'm not. Possibly 1 or 2 words changed just to make the beat fit, but more or less directly. And it's just interesting that it also is a song that's making a myth out of somebody, and he didn't mention it. Isn't it like Dylan not to mention the one that actually quotes Homer? Maybe he doesn't want people to know. The lines like "I'm bone weary." What is it? I'm bone weary. What is it? I'm bone weary, about to breathe my last. That's one of them. Cooped up on an island for far too long. That's another one. But there's at least 6 of them.
I'm going to definitely look that up on from what you said. I didn't know that. I'm sort of stunned by that. That's very interesting, and how he ties things together in a tapestry from all these different places, and they fit so well, like picturing John laying on the ground in New York, and with that line mixed in, and then it comes from there. It's the way he weaves it together is, that's where he...
No, it is. It's extraordinary. I mean, back in the time of Time Out of Mind, when he started writing in this way with all these embedded references and these lines taken from all different places, or when we first started to notice it so much, because I was writing on it at the time and it was going to come out in Troubadour, I was collecting every single reference I could. I'm noting them all down, and I was swapping them. There was a chap with everybody, the whole Dylan sort of community was. And there was a chap in Poland, Arthur something. His site's down now, so can't remember his name exactly. But it was Arthur something. He was putting them up on the web, so I sent him all of mine, and we had loads for that. And then when Love and Theft came out, I mean, I got up to over 70% of it being quoted from elsewhere, the lyrics and a lot of the music as well. But then, with the internet, loads and loads of other people were doing it as well. And then, as I say, Scott Wormuth came along, and he's done such a great job of it. I more or less gave up. I do have a little thing in my computer where I keep lists here for myself, and I must send them off to him actually, because we might as well have them all in the one place. But it is interesting. It's there's a lot in Roll On John, and there's a lot in all the songs that are taken from all different kinds of places, and it makes you wonder. But I just thought it was such a Dylan thing to do, not to mention that one as one of the ones of Homeric value.
Andy, I wanted to go into a question I had. When I had asked you 10 songs that you might pick to justify Dylan's Nobel Prize, and like we spoke a lot about songs that came out well after 1965, many of which I love, and because I first really started listening in 81, the songs from Then Meant a Lot to me, as you had said before, I went back for other songs. But about your list, not just to pick through the list, but one thing struck me. I almost could justify his Nobel Prize by what he'd written by 1965 with those 3 albums you had mentioned before. I thought that was incredible. I mean, is there any validity to what I'm saying? I think, like, when you took Bringing It All Back Home, Highway 61, and Blonde on Blonde, and the songs that had preceded it on those albums, some which were, sung in front of Martin Luther King at the March on Washington, it almost seems to me if Dylan had stopped recording in 65, you almost could still consider him for that award. Am I wrong?
No, I think you're absolutely right, and that's without including 66. But if you stretch it to 66, I have pretty much a feeling. I mean, I hope I'm wrong in what I'm about to say, but I have a feeling that's what the award from the Swedish people came from, because the way they commented on Dylan's albums, nothing against Modern Times, but to put it as one of the masterpieces of literature, and not to mention, say, John Wesley Hardin, where the lyrics were actually written before the music for once, and where you can read it from the page. It just gave me the feeling that they stopped at Blonde on Blonde, which was the album she kept mentioning. I may be wrong in that, and I hope I'm wrong, because he's done wonderful things since '66. I mean, for me, Blood on the Tracks, 74 is the best single album. On the other hand, the 18 Months I mentioned before are just, incredible. They're my second, third, and fourth favourite albums. So to have them one after another just seems ridiculous. And as you pointed out, apart from each one of those being full of masterpieces, and when I say full, I mean really the majority of songs in each of those albums is just extraordinary. Before that, there were great songs too, of Nobel literary worth. Hard Rain's Gonna Fall. And one of my favourites, Chimes of Freedom, which I think is, an astonishing piece of work. And actually, what's interesting about some of these is some of these you could read from the page, but it doesn't contradict what I said earlier. I still think, to get the full value, you certainly need to hear Dylan sing them. But, lines from Chimes of Freedom like, through the mad mystic hammering of the wild dripping hail, the sky cracked its poems in naked wonder. You can read that on a page, all the stuff about the wild cathedral evening, and it's just fantastic. But I'm going to jump to your 1981 in a minute to compare a song to this, because every now and again you see a Dylan song like Chimes of Freedom where you do feel it's written like a poem in its structure, in its cohesion, in its tautness. The thing with a song is, and it's not to say there were songs, because the rules about writing poems and songs are so different. A poem has to be economical. Every single letter has to mean something, and change the tempo. Whereas, of course, if you're writing a song lyric, you've got the music to control the tempo and a lot of the meaning. But the attention to detail when he's on fire is worthy of the greatest poets. There's a line in that, electric light still struck like arrows. I'm sorry, I'm not saying it very well because I keep hearing his voice, and nothing can compare to that. But electric light still struck like arrows. The C's and the T's there are like the arrows striking, electric light still struck. That comes across on the page, but it comes across so much better when you hear him sing it. And my favourite line in it, apart from the extremely poetic lines, my favourite sort of cute line, I think, in it, he's got this line for the mistreated, mateless mother, the mistitled prostitute. I absolutely love that. You've got the M sounds, the sort of soft feminine sounds, ma, mama, from mammary, obviously, in English. But in all languages, M is the sound for women. And then you've got followed by the S and the T. And that's what's happening. The feminine's being attacked in the line. And you can actually hear it in the letters. The mistreated, mateless mother, the mistitled prostitute. When you read it, you can only read mistitled prostitute one way, which is that she's wrongly called prostitute. But when you hear it two ways. It's the mistreated, mateless mother, the mistitled prostitute. Now that could be Miss, M-I-S-S, titled prostitute, a miss who's called a prostitute. And the reason she's a miss called a prostitute is that she's mateless. Mateless, unmarried woman, miss unmarried woman. And all of that packed into one line from one song. Yeah, should have given the prize for that line alone.
Well, it gives me chills when I think of those lines and you read those lines. If we talked about Dylan up to 65 and you corrected me with 66, and if we even skip a little further into his career, suppose I jump to say 75, 74, you said Blood on the Tracks. If we look at his career from 74 to the present day, so many times people have tried to write Dylan off. And they'd say he's done, he's a shell of himself. Some very vicious criticism, which I guess anytime an artist, especially in the popular media, say, like there comes a point where they want to do them in, it's almost like a backlash. But he seems to have taken it much harder than other people. It seems almost out of jealousy sometimes. But if we take him from 74 on to present day, and, obviously the stuff before that, there's so many masterpieces. But how would you rate the material that came out from, say, Blood on the Tracks to present day? Has anyone matched that in that time period in your mind?
No. No, they haven't, because they haven't. And, I can imagine if anybody who's not particularly a Dylan nut listening to this will probably be throwing their hands up and, just thinking I'm biased. But I don't think anybody in the field he's in comes near Dylan. It's a bit like comparing somebody to Shakespeare, in my opinion. It's pointless. And that's not to say there's not other geniuses in the world, but none of them to me, in the written world, none of them to me, or the drama world, none compared to Shakespeare. I adore Dostoevsky, but, I put Shakespeare on his own, and as far as God knows I love people like Neil Young and the Beatles and loads of other people, but Dylan's way out on his own, I think. So, every grain of sand on its own to me. I take the entire collections of virtually anybody else. I know that sounds extreme, but if you start thinking of things like Blind Willie McTell, there's still a lot of masterpieces to come, and then of course there's the late Renaissance after Time Out of Mind. But an album like Oh Mercy, I think it's fantastic, and it's got 3 great outtakes as well. Just top dollar stuff. But it has been more patchy. There's no doubt about it that it's been patchier. And as you say, there's always sharks willing and desperate, in fact, to get their teeth into Dylan. I think part of the fact is they feel Dylan's been putting them on. He's been needling them for so long. A lot of people think they don't get Dylan and he's too clever, and a lot of people don't like the idea that so many of us look up to him so much. And there's lots of people always waiting to stick the knife into him. I'm afraid that's always been the case in his career. But if you take the albums and all the outtakes since even after Blood on the Tracks, it's still a pretty amazing body of work. I mean, it really is. You could put together quite a collection of CDs. And here's the big thing, that's only studio work. As you know, there's the live work as well. So, going right back to 75, the very year after we're talking about, you've got the Rolling Thunder Review. Well, I think, the live music is as much, if not more, a statement than the albums. As Dylan says, the albums are just blueprints for what he does live.
And you're like an expert, I don't mean to drop the word, you can make it trite, but you really are in my mind. And I don't like many people who write about Dylan because I think they miss the depth. That's not like saying my thoughts are so deep or I could do better. But when I go to read a book, I'll read yourself and I'll read Clinton Hayland. And for the most part, the other books to me are picture books. Like I want to look at the pictures because it's a waste of my time to read it. I'm not saying I can match some of those people. I'm simply saying a fact. I think you two guys are the best expositors on him, and definitely worth our time. Now that Dylan's won the Nobel to these people who've been looking to write him off, can he now sort of just sit back and, I don't know how much time he does or doesn't pay to the critics. I think at times everybody's human and you're going to feel some of the sting of what they say. But in some way, as much as he eschews awards, I think this has to feel good to some extent after going through so much criticism at times.
Yeah, but I mean, I think one thing you said there is true of all writers in the middle. They all say that they never pay any attention to critics and they ignore them, which they more or less got to say. But you know that they do because they always, they always lash out at them. You can, be it F. Scott Fitzgerald or Bob, somehow they do. Whether they say they read the reviews or not, somehow they do know what's being said, and on occasions they've lashed out back against them, and it must be terribly frustrating. I think the artist's always in the right, and us writers are always in the wrong, I think. But to your point, does this feel like vindication? I think this feels like vindication to a lot of fans, I should say, because I really do remember very clearly having arguments with my university lecturers in the 1970s, saying that Dylan was as important as the people we were studying, and one of them had even been to the Isle of Wight, and they just completely scorned me. And I remember saying, that students used to say this about T.S. Eliot, and their lecturers laughed at them. And there's another Nobel Prize winner. And it's true, T.S. Eliot was first of all popular amongst young people and students before the lecturers caught up with them a generation later. And now the same thing's happened with Dylan. I think he probably does in a way, as you say, Bob. I think he probably does feel this is vindication and won back at the naysayers, etc. But I also think Dylan's always known his worth. There's a very early clip of him at a typewriter with Joan Baez behind him, and he's typing something, and she says something about the line he's putting in, and he says, "Oh, I'm just putting it in to confuse all the professors and everybody later." This was very early 60s. And so I don't know if he was just tongue-in-cheek, but you wonder if he actually already knew. And I've actually got a slight worry. I said I was worried about the Nobel putting him in this box called literature and sort of forgetting all the other skills that he's got, and he's wonderful singing in particular. But the problem with awards is, where do you go from here? I mean, he's had so many awards. You don't want it to feel like it's going to be like, well, I've done it now, because the whole thing about Dylan, he not being busy born is busy dying. You don't want him to think, well, I've done it, I've proven them wrong. You want him to still want to keep proving them wrong. It kind of reminds me of Wordsworth. I know I keep jumping into poets, but to me, well, we can count Bob as a poet now, surely. Wordsworth was an English poet who grew to fame when he was young and the French Revolution was on, and he talked about bliss to be alive in that dawn, but to be young was very heaven. I've slightly misquoted that. It's getting too late at night for me. But, you get the idea. And then fast forward to the end of his life, and he's the poet laureate, and he's showered with awards, and he goes to big dinners, and, everybody fets him. And then the young poet Shelley is complaining about this old man who's now the establishment, who used to rail against the establishment. I don't want Bob ever to be the establishment, I suppose. Maybe I'm just hankering after my youth here.
I agree with you. I think part of the refreshing part of Dylan is he took, this high literature and he gave it to the common man. And, he made it for the average person, and you didn't have to, I respect, intellectuals. I don't mean it, my throwing a stone, but he sort of took it. You don't have to be an intellectual to listen to Bob Dylan and hear something deep about life. There is something he sort of stole it back. He took the word and the written word back for the average person. And I think there's something to be said for that. That's very powerful.
No, I think that's brilliant because that sums up actually why I'm pleased about the Nobel Award, because that's the biggest thing Dylan did. Was that he introduced that literary sensibility into something we all love, which is pop and rock music. I mean, Bob can still play Rita May and songs like that. It doesn't all have to be deep philosophical stuff, and it isn't with other poets either. Poets write about everything. They write about silly things. They write sexy stuff, they write philosophical stuff, they write any kind of stuff, as does Bob. But yeah, I think the thing he'll always be remembered for, and I hope the Nobel is actually eventually this is what it's sort of seen as, is that he brought that literature into the rock form, and he changed all our lives because of that, and it's quite an amazing thing that he did, really.
And as for the critics, it just sticks in my mind. It's like, how many times must a man, write a masterpiece before you call him a master?
Yeah, it takes a long time. I'm actually really surprised it's happened in my lifetime, because I'd almost given up hope. I was shocked, and all I'm saying about I'm worried about the Nobel Prize putting him in a box, and I'm worried about it seeming like establishment and everything. I nearly it was like a goal at football. I sort of jumped up with joy when I heard the news, because it is just a great thing, and it's not to be snobby and intellectual. What you said there about listening to Dylan, you don't need to get the connections to old poets and everything. That's the whole point. And I mentioned before T.S. Eliot, and there was an English poet called Ted Hughes, a very great poet himself, and he says that he first heard T.S. Eliot. He heard T.S. Eliot reading his own poems, and he loved them, and he knew they were great, but he didn't understand a word of them. But he knew that one day he would. And I thought, that was very similar to me hearing that Dylan album all that time ago. I knew there was something profound, but I had no idea what was really going on until I was older, until I'd heard them a lot more times. But somehow, and it's one of the wonders of poetry, I suppose, and poetic language, somehow there's an important message here. But you don't need to sit down and do it as a book. You can just do it for fun, put your feet up, have a bottle of beer, and stick on an album.
Sure, I didn't mean to interrupt. The beauty of language and the beauty of music, can be enjoyed by a baby. I mean, a child, and sort of, at a high intellectual level, you can alienate from the pleasure of that, which I think is much deeper than simply saying a child is so simple they grasp it at a simple level. In some ways, they might be far more understanding it far more deeply than a really developed mind. And there's nothing wrong with a really developed mind. But I wanted to skip over a bit I really liked Tempest in 2013, and Dylan had made a quote. He said, "I almost made it a more overtly religious album." And I know I jumped into that from what we were talking about, but I liked Tempest, and I was wondering, I know the title could be taken from the Old Testament or from Shakespeare. And I was wondering what you thought of that album and what he meant by the quote about it could have been a more overtly religious album, and he almost did that.
I'll take the quote first of all. I took the quote to mean, I still take the quote to mean, that this is a religious album. I think he was being a little bit, funny, as he often does. He says something to draw attention to something in a slightly different way, and I think it's a very religious album, and I think he was just pointing that out. I think he was having a little joke and see if people would pick up on it or not. Of course, I could be wrong in that, but I mean, some of it is plain scripture almost, isn't it? I mean, bits of Narrow Way come straight from the Bible, and the whole album's suffused in religious imagery. I mean, there's a lot of death in it, so I suppose that would bring in religion anyway. But it seems to me, it seems to me quite a strongly religious album. I think religion hasn't really ever gone away. I think maybe get people shouting at me for this one, but I think religion's pretty much underpinned everything since since Slow Train Coming.
Well, in my mind, like, he did the same thing to religion, what he did with poetry, just strictly on an intellectual level. He gave it back to the people. For me personally, my own thing when I listen to it is, he took it away from the institutions, the institutional churches, and he made it relevant in a very personal way, because it was what he had gone through. And it's not something I like to see divide people or have it say holier than thou or something. It's definitely, he preached early on, but I thought by Tempest he was a tempered person of belief. And when he, the one line is that as the Titanic is sinking in the song Tempest, he's saying he read the book of Revelation. I mean, I think he handed away what he was really talking about, and I think he took Christian music to a place people haven't acknowledged yet, in that he didn't just write a gospel song where you're just quoting scripture verbatim and singing it. He intellectualized it in a sense, and also it came through his heart, but he put it out in imagery, and it was almost like he took it to a deeper level. And I hadn't seen another artist do that. I like Johnny Cash's gospel music and such, and there's so many other people who play it, but I don't think anybody came close to understanding what he really did on Tempest.
Mm. Yeah, well, interesting point. When I said, religion's underpinned everything, I didn't mean it was the same view, because he was preaching at the beginning, and he had a very fixed and not particularly pleasant, in my opinion, interpretation of Christianity and of things, but he had a very fixed view at the beginning, and it's certainly changed a lot since then, and of course we don't know what his particular beliefs are, though on that point I do think it's sometimes rude and disrespectful when people ask him in interviews what his beliefs are straight after he's done a concert where he's opened with Rock of Ages, for example. That used to drive me mad in the early part of this century, but anyway, no, it's changed out of all I don't even know what word to say. It's changed dramatically, time after time. I just mean that the religious imagery is always there. But sometimes it's very difficult to follow. I mean, I actually find Joker Man, a wonderful song though it is, I find it quite hard to really follow exactly what his religious point, if you want, is there, perhaps because I don't know enough about religion. But you're right, The Tempest is different again. So there's been lots of differences in between 79 and now, and lots of lighter touches of religion and lots of more in-depth touches of it. I think Oh Mercy, is a very religious album in a way that's much more obvious than in The Tempest, because in The Tempest you've got this tremendous violence. I mean, some of the imagery is so hard and brutal. It's such an energetic, violent album. In a way, I love Long and Wasted Years and Soon After Midnight. I love them for what they are, but I also love them just because I don't think I could take another couple of pay and blood type bludgeonings as we go along. I've got something in my pocket that will make your eyeballs swim. Was that one of the lines? I mean, it's really harsh stuff. And I think, I really like The Tempest, and I think he's doing all kinds of interesting things with songs. You mentioned the Book of Revelations. I think that's absolutely crucial to the Titanic song. I also think it leads into to Roll On John. I think part of that isn't about John Lennon. It's about the Book of Revelations. But that's another point. But all the way through it, I think he's doing things with songs that are very interesting. Tin Angel, for example, it's almost impossible to follow. But if you look at the ballads that it's based on, he's doing something very experimental with bringing them together. And if Scarlet Town is obviously a take on folk songs, and Titanic itself, Tempest, a take on all the Titanic songs, as well as having the Book of Revelations. I think what really makes that is the Watchman. He really makes it different. But the rest of the song, it's got lovely melody, but it's so like the early ones, and yet it's so different. And suddenly you've got a reference to the film Titanic with DiCaprio in it. It's really strange. So I think he's playing with perspectives a lot all the way through it. And the religion's quite hard to follow at times, isn't it? There's a lot of dialogues, I think, going on between the songs, and within the songs you're not quite sure who's speaking at certain times. And at the end of Tin Angel, I'm never quite sure who it is that's speaking.
Well, it's funny, like you had mentioned the Watchman, and it came to me like all along the Watchtower. It's almost like, these things are so interrelated. It's interesting to put the songs together. But, and we also said, I'm just going to push the needle a little further just because, let people argue and be a little riled up. They're used to it with Dylan. But like he's made statements like I am a believer, and then they said, well, you sound like a believer on that song. He said, well, I am a believer a couple of years ago, and then so he hadn't abandoned it. And then when he gave the speech when he won the award that Jimmy Carter gave him, and he said, I almost put out a gospel album. I believe he told me it was the Blackwood Brothers, and he said that's nothing new for me. Who are these Blackwood Brothers, and do you know what he was talking about there?
Yeah, they're I'm not an expert on them by any means, but they're a family group that go back to the Depression, back to the 1930s, and they've continued Christian music, gospel music, quartet, very famous, very big in Elvis's mind. Elvis really liked them, and so much so that they played at Elvis's mother's funeral. and you know what Bob thinks of Elvis, so that's another connection in there. I still tend to think that Bob was actually saying that. Maybe a little plug for the Blackwood Brothers, if they've got exactly the kind of history you'd want musically. And if he was thinking of a gospel album, it's exactly it would be right up his street. But I think also at that point, in my mind, he was sort of pointing out that The Tempest is in fact, it is in fact a religious album. But I don't know who's to know with Bob. It'd be an interesting connection. But you've got loads of connections there with the Christian music, the gospel music, with Elvis.
Well, there's a lot of these tight connections to Elvis and the gospel. But I think you're a fascinating cat, and even when I listen to it, with what God has given me to understand things, the interrelationships in these songs and the depth, even when he's speaking, it's so much fun to think about what he meant and what I missed and what puzzle piece was in there. Now, another thing that threw me for a loop, and I guess since I came in '81, that was when he put, Shout of Love out, as you know, and that period had thrown people, but since I stepped in at that moment, it didn't throw me as much because I was like, this is the first thing I'm hearing. But with these Frank Sinatra records, I have to tell you, I didn't expect that at all. I maybe would have expected a track, and I loved when he did the 80th birthday for Frank and he sang Restless Farewell. I think that's my favorite TV appearance of his. But could you go into your understanding of what maybe led him in to do these Sinatra records? I guess I figured he always liked them, but I didn't know the depth. To put 2 straight albums out of anyone is quite a tribute, especially from an artist as deep as Dylan and his reputation preceding him, to pick one fellow and do 2 albums based on his songs. I guess you had corrected me once before when we spoke. It really isn't a Sinatra covers album per se, but it's all songs Sinatra had covered. But I thought that day when I asked you that question, your answer fascinated me, so maybe I could pull you into that for our listeners a little bit.
Yeah. I mean, they're definitely tributes to Sinatra. I was just saying, the standard songs that other singers and other singers that Dylan's connected with have covered as well. But yes, I mean, 2 albums is an extraordinary tribute, and especially from somebody like Dylan. But if we roll it back a bit to how surprising it is, I mean, it is surprising to have 2, but how surprising it is for him to cover Sinatra, it's not quite as much as possibly it seemed to you when he came in, because he had actually mentioned Sinatra and Sinatra's friends quite a few times in interviews over the years. He mentioned Dean Martin quite a lot. Incidentally, did you know he's just filmed a Tony Bennett tribute?
You've stunned me, sir. Tell me about it.
Because you were mentioning the Restless Farewell for Frank's 80th, I think it was. I love that one too. I think it was such a perfect song for the occasion, and it's just very moving to see the 2 of them. He filmed last week a tribute. We don't know what song it is, sorry, but a tribute for Tony Bennett's 90th. There's a show coming up for Tony Bennett's 90th, and Bob can't be there, so he's done a Tony Bennett song. Which will be shown, on a big screen at the actual event at the 90th tribute. So that's another interesting one. It kind of fits in with all this. So he had mentioned Frank Sinatra. I said very near the beginning of this, that one of the things that I first thought was, and still think is absolutely brilliant about Dylan, is his phrasing. Well, one of the contenders to be right up there with phrasing genius is Frank Sinatra, which must have. It must always be in Dylan's mind, I think. But the other thing I think to remember is Dylan's age. Dylan was born in 41. He was already an adult before the 60s came. I know we always associate him with the 60s, but he was a teenager in the 50s, and he grew up in the 40s. When I was a kid, before a teenager, I mean, I heard the Beatles all the time because my parents played them, and they were on the radio non-stop. Well, Frank Sinatra would have been non-stop on the radio when Bob was growing up. Frank was huge because of the explosion that was Elvis Presley. It's probably not so much known by people since then how big Frank Sinatra was, but he really was. He had Beatlemania type, screaming girls after him, and everything he did was in the front page of the newspaper. So he'd have been everywhere, and you've got to think that there were people in Dylan's family who'd have favourite Frank Sinatra songs that he'd associate with them, and obviously liked him. And there's the bit in Chronicles. Now I know Chronicles is more a fictive memoir than an autobiography, but although the things in it might not be absolutely true in a literal sense. That they're certainly true in an emotional sense. I think everybody who reads Chronicles, really feels like Bob's speaking to them, and I think he is. And he talks really beautifully about the effect listening to Frank Sinatra's Ebb Tide on a jukebox in New York had on him. And he used to play it, and this is when he was in a folk. This is when he was just folk music as far as everybody else knew. But he would play Ebb Tide on this jukebox in New York. But then he says he couldn't play it too much because he had to go his own way at that point. But he actually said that the song contained. I'm sorry, I can't remember the exact quote, but it's something like the song contained the whole universe. That's a hell of a thing to say about one thing on a jukebox. So if you add all that together, it's maybe not so surprising. I mean, it is surprising that there's 2 albums of it. Do you like them, by the way?
I like when he writes his own songs. You're catching me flat-footed. I'm just going to answer honestly. I try to answer everything honestly, but I mean, I was disappointed in that I would love to have heard him writing some of his own songs following up Tempest, because that was a personal favorite. I'm not saying it's Highway 61 or Blonde on Blonde, but I really enjoyed it, and I was looking for a follow-up that I'm still waiting for. That said, when I got over that disappointment and I sit down and listen to what he's doing and the importance that those songs hold to him, I like Frank Sinatra, but it opened me more deeply to the artist Frank Sinatra was, the nuance Frank Sinatra had, the depth, the songs that he chose to sing, and Dylan clearly understood that well. So once again, Dylan expanded my mind to something I'd say, oh, a Frank Sinatra song's on, gee, I like him, being a middle-class guy from Queens, New York. And then Dylan blows my mind open a little more in yet another area, and I came to a much deeper understanding of Frank Sinatra because I wanted to know what Dylan saw in him. So in that, from being disappointed that he didn't write his own songs and follow up Tempest in the way I would have liked, he surprised me again, and he made me understand Frank Sinatra at a much deeper level, and that genre of the Great American Songbook, which I probably wouldn't have delved into as deeply. So once again, as an artist, I say to the guy, thank you, and you brought me back from the land of the mediocre in my thinking, and you expanded my mind, and what more can you ask from a pop album?
No, absolutely, and he's done that to me all my life. The amount of poets I've read, books I've read, and obviously the amount of music that I've listened to, all thanks to Bob, it's quite extraordinary, and when he was doing Time Out of Mind interviews, I actually, in my more obsessive days, I actually somehow managed to get a recording of the Newsweek interview. I don't know how I got it. I can't remember now. But there was a bit off. It wasn't off mic, obviously, but it was off the official interview. And the guy asked Bob what books he was reading at the time, and Bob mentioned a couple. So of course, I immediately went out and bought them and read them. And they were good. So he opens up all these things. But there's another lovely thing about the Sinatra albums, I think. Given my fears about him being put in a box called literature and his voice being forgotten, I think there's something lovely about the fact he gets the Nobel Prize for Literature after 2 albums of covers of songs made famous by Frank Sinatra. That just amuses me somehow. But you're right, it's a long time since The Tempest. It's actually 2012, would you believe? It's over 4 years now. Since
a new one. One that he's written.
I know.
This stuff. I'd apologize for.
I remember the gap between. I remember the gap between Under the Red Sky and Time Out of Mind, and we were all going nuts waiting on a new Dylan album. And we liked the cover albums. There was 2 cover albums then. I really loved World Gone Wrong. I thought it was wonderful. But there was an ache to hear. We always want to hear what's on his mind, don't we?
Definitely. And it's funny, I just wanted to put on a little anecdote of my own. I was interviewing Robert Davi, who's a character actor, and he's made, I think, 137 movies. He was doing a Sinatra show. And as I was interviewing him over the course of a week to do an article, and I covered one of his shows, he knew how much I liked Dylan, and he must have at that point been recording that video with Bob Dylan. And he didn't let on to me. I guess, maybe he wasn't allowed to, but he never told me that they were making that, and even privately I would have loved to have heard those stories and never repeated them. But Robert Davi, if you're listening, I enjoyed interviewing you, but I'm still mad that you didn't relate to me that you were doing that at the time. And if I interview you again or see one of your shows again, you'd do well to tell me those stories before I write what I think of your show, even though it's wonderful. But I'm just kidding.
Yeah.
Well, and I just have one more question, and then I want to turn it over to Josh. What can we expect from Dylan now after these Sinatra albums are done? What's going to be released?
Oh, you're not really asking me to second guess what Bob's going to do next, are you? It's I'm far too long in the tooth for that. He surprised me all my life. I'm sure he'll continue to. But we do know about the bootleg series, of course, because they've more or less announced the gospel years 79 to 81 is going to be the bootleg series set. But before that, we've got this 36 CD 1966 coming out next month. So with the 36 CD 1966, which, you know, to me that's the holy grail for me. I just think it's going to be just the absolute peak. You know, I think that the second half of each show is the greatest rock music I've ever heard, and I prefer the first half to the second half. That's, you know, that's how good it's going to be for me. It's just going to be beyond belief for me. And then when I've recovered from that, the gospel series will come out 79 to 81, and I think that'll be well, from all accounts of what's coming out on that's going to be a set and a half as well.
Well, I'm looking forward to that, and I just wanted to say as I turn it over to Josh, who's been patient as we were talking, and I really love this. I just want to say, in my mind, and I followed Dylan since '81, and read, you know, tons of books on him. There's Clinton Halen, and there's Andy Muir, and there's a bunch of picture books. So thank you for those books.
Wait a minute, you're very kind, but what about the other great writers? What about the Michael Grays and Stephen Scobies? There's lots of, and lots of other ones. There's lots of great writers out there, you know. But you're very kind to me, which is nice.
But if I had to take two writers' works with me to a desert island, and I could read more about my favorite artist, it would be you two guys in that box that I take along with me.
Yeah,
thank you for the work.
Thank you. And
Josh, are you with us?
Still here.
All right, we turn it over to you. So rock the house, my brother.
What's up, Andy? How are you, sir?
I'm okay, Josh. I'm okay. It's approaching midnight here. That sounds like a line from a Dylan song.
It probably is. Okay, I'll be honest, and I hope I don't infuriate listeners or anything like that, but I don't know a whole lot about him, only by name. So I guess the first thing I would want to ask is, what would you tell someone who doesn't know anything about him about who the man is?
Oh, what was the first thing I would say? What, to sum up his... Oh, I think the thing is to dive in and listen to the records, really. I think that's the best thing. If you're saying to me now, somebody who knows nothing about Dylan at all, I would say get a hold of either Blonde on Blonde or Blood on the Tracks and just put yourself in a room and just play it through and then play it through again and then play it through again.
All right. Sounds good. Cool. So was he more a singer or songwriter?
Both at the same time.
Cool.
I mean, he's obviously very famous for the songs that he wrote. But, you know, he when he started out, he was playing folk songs and covers of Woody Guthrie songs. And at the moment, he's covering Frank Sinatra songs. So he's a bit of both.
That's awesome. I actually wouldn't mind hearing that because I'm a big Sinatra fan myself.
Well, that would be interesting. Not all Sinatra fans take to it.
Well, we'll see. I mean, I'm very Italian, so we'll find out if it's up to par or not with Mr. Dylan. So.
I love Sinatra too, by the way.
What's that?
I love Sinatra too, by the way.
Yeah, is he like your favorite of that group?
Yeah, of that era, yes, definitely.
Nice. I like him and I like Dean, and then I always thought those two were the best out of the whole pack.
Well, Dean always makes me laugh, you know.
Yeah. No, he's hilarious. He's a very talented dude.
And Bob likes him too.
Do you like Dean also, Bob?
No, I meant Bob. I meant Bob Dylan. Bob Dylan likes him, is what I meant.
Oh.
But didn't you have some John Lennon questions to work in here too?
I do. I have.
Yeah, you weren't supposed to be asking me about Bob.
Beatles, you can ask about Bob too, but I know Beatles magazine is straining at the leash to hear what you had to ask about John Lennon.
All right. What was the relationship like between Dylan, the Beatles, and Lennon?
Well, Dylan and the Beatles, it was a complicated relationship, both with the Beatles as a group and then with individuals, but complicated in the sense of there was a lot of friendly rivalry going on, and you've got to remember, what huge stars they were, and obviously there was quite some egos going at times, especially between Lennon and Bob. But Bob loved the Beatles from the minute he first heard them. And it gets off to a great start, the story. Bob loved the Beatles from the minute he first heard them. There's a famous quote about him saying how outrageously great their chords are. This was at a time when the Beatles had, I think, something like 8, this is roughly correct, eight songs in the top 10 and 4 of the top 5 or something. So as Dylan was driving about, or being driven about, as the case was then, they were listening to the radio, and of course it was Beatles song after Beatles song after Beatles song, and he just loved them. Meanwhile, the Beatles all loved. And there's lots of there's lots of quotes from the Beatles on this. The Beatles all loved the Freewheelin' album, which they were playing around. They were playing and commenting on a lot. So there was started off with tremendous mutual admiration, and then they met in 64, 65, and 66, and Bob famously introduced them to marijuana in 64.
That's awesome. Can you tell us about the song that Mr. Dylan wrote as a tribute to John Lennon?
Roll on, John. We were talking earlier on about Tempest, and there's this long track called Tempest, which really feels like the end of the album. And in a way, I think it might actually have ended better in a way, as an album, I mean. And then there's this other song called Roll On John, which stands slightly aside from the album and yet is strongly connected to it. So it's obviously very moving, because there's poignant lines about the Beatles playing in Hamburg and the Quarrymen, and lots of lines from the Beatles and especially from John Lennon in the song. And obviously it can't help but be moving. Dylan looking back and singing this song, but I think it's a more complicated song than that, and I think there's more than one John involved, but at least 3 Johns involved, in fact, and part of it is what Bob was saying earlier on about the Tempest nearly ending with a reference to the Book of Revelations. That seems to be picked up in this song, because not everything fits for the Beatles. There's things that don't fit. You get quite early on, you get a clue that things aren't going to be straightforward, because there's an opening, which is enough to make one cry. There's an opening about Lennon being shot, and then you get the line, "They shot him in the back." Obviously, you'd expect he shot them in the back. Now, Dylan could just mean they, meaning fans or society in general. And he has said in an interview, the thing about fans is they killed John Lennon, so that's the kind of they covered there. But then you've got a line about down in the quarry with the Quarrymen, and you wonder why he's saying quarry twice. I think the songs goes on to all these different ways, as well as being a tribute to John Lennon. I think we've got there's a lot of work being done on this by other people, so I'm trying not to take credit from them. I started off by writing to a very creative Dylan critic called John Stokes, who was writing an article at the time about being John of the Book of Revelations, being one of the Johns in the song, and we talked about that for a while, but we were still stuck with the verse with the line about where the buffalo roam. And somebody else, I think it was somebody called Dave Harrison, worked out that verse fitted somebody called John Smith, who went from England to America, of course, much like Lennon did. So I think there's other things in the song as well, but the Lennon tribute's, I think, lovely, and I'm sure that Lennon would absolutely adore the fact that Bob ties in quotes from William Blake, the great revolutionary English poet, which is what John Lennon wanted to be as well as wanting to be Bob Dylan, one suspects. I think that was a lovely tribute, and of course it's very moving. But I think it's a song that works on different levels as well. And just to go back to something I was saying earlier about the Nobel Prize and Homer, this is the song I mentioned. It's got at least 6 lines straight from one particular translation of Homer's Odyssey in it. And given what I've just said about the other Johns, I think it's Dylan making a myth again. And of course, lots of people have said, why did he take so long to write, put out a tribute to John Lennon? Why didn't he do it sort of at the time or soon afterwards? And I think the space of time is important, because I think the problem with Hurricane and Joey was, if you make a myth about something that's actually now, you get into all kinds of problems. If you make a myth out of something that's slightly set in the past, you don't have that problem. And I think, he's the great thing about the tribute is I think he's doing it as John Lennon as a myth that will go on forever, as the Book of Revelations does. I don't mean he's saying those two things are analogous in that kind of way, but in the idea of it being a myth that will continue, I think it's very moving that way.
Cool. That's awesome. Sorry.
It's okay.
All right. So Bob Dylan recorded Things We Said Today, and it was a early Paul McCartney track. Can you tell us about that and the story between the two artists?
Yeah, well, Things We Said Today was the Dylan cover for a tribute album called The Art of McCartney. I'm not usually very keen on tribute albums. I generally hate the Dylan ones, but because Dylan was on somebody else's, of course, I listened to it. And it's such a strange thing for me to hear, because one of my earliest memories of the Beatles is Hard Day's Night. I was far too young to actually follow it. I was only about 5 or 6 years old, and my older sister took me, bless her. I don't remember the song from there, but you grow up with the Beatles in Britain, so I knew the song. And I knew the song, I think it's one of McCartney's early really great songs, but I knew the song as young men, and in particular McCartney, looking forward to a time when a love affair would be over and he'd be looking back on it as an older person. So it was very strange to hear it in Dylan's very old voice. It's quite a sort of double take. And, the song's about once you've broken up and you're looking back on things, you'll remember things you said today. And so looking to the future, you'll remember things. And when Dylan sings it, it almost sounds like a threat, whereas with the Beatles, it was a joyful song. So that was quite a thing. I'd be very interested to know what long-term Beatle fans think of Dylan's cover. Probably slightly worried about it as well, actually.
So you also, this might be an odd question. Again, I don't know much about Dylan. I'm doing my best here. Sorry. Was he a poet like Shakespeare was, or were they totally separate in that respect?
Well, they're very separate because they're separated by hundreds of years, and Shakespeare was a playwright is the main thing. But there are a tremendous amount of connections between the two of them. They were both popular artists in their time, and not considered. I mean, Dylan now is because of the Nobel laureate, because he's lived long enough to get these awards. Shakespeare didn't. In Shakespeare's time, theatre was considered, a bad thing, much in the same way that rock and roll was considered a bad thing at the beginning. And people tried to shut it down, and particularly when it became professional and people started making money out of it, people got even angrier. So Dylan getting booed by the folk fans wasn't just for going electric, it was because electric meant you were going commercial and you were taking credit, you were taking copyright of the songs, and you were taking the money. And the whole idea of the folk process was anybody could steal anything from anybody else. But you didn't get paid for it. You didn't get copyright for it. And in Shakespeare's time, before Shakespeare, the generation before him, people put on plays for free. So when they started charging for plays, there was an outcry similar to the Judas one. But there are many connections between them. And in fact, I've written a very long article on this, which you can find on my website if you search hard enough. But it's easier actually to find it on the Shakespeare website, which you can get to from the previous link. But it is such a big subject. I'm not trying to put you off. It's such a huge subject. And also, much as I adore Dylan, I don't want to say he's the equal of Shakespeare, because as I said before, I don't think anybody is. But the connections between them, and Dylan himself has made a lot of remarks about Shakespeare, and he made a very interesting remark at the Musicaires, another award he got recently, where he gave a marvellous speech afterwards, and he actually talked about his stuff being like the mystery plays that came before Shakespeare. And his stuff very much is like that, because they were a mixture of stories from the Bible and crude physical humour, slapstick humour, body humour, jokes about bodily functions. It sounds a heck of a lot like the Basement Tapes or the Tempest. So yeah, there's lots and lots of connections, but it's really a huge subject.
Mm-hmm. I would love to hear about that sometime. That's pretty cool.
We'll do another show.
All right, sounds good. The relation of Dylan and Shakespeare would be amazing. You could do a whole musical about that, probably.
You could indeed. Well, Shakespeare wrote songs as well, so there's a lot in there.
That's cool. I'm surprised no one's done a Shakespeare-like musical.
Oh, they have. They have.
Oh, they have.
They have, and lots of plays have been turned into musicals.
Oh, wow. Well, yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. Wow.
Bob wanted, sorry to break in, but Bob wanted a bit of background to the Beatles. I think he wants more Beatles stuff. Should I say about when I was growing up with the Beatles or not?
I was training at Toulouse, wondering about when you grew up and when you first heard the Beatles and John Lennon and what effect he had on you.
Okay.
That's what I was sitting here quietly thinking, so please fill us in on that because I'm straining at Toulouse to hear this.
Yeah. Well, one of the things I'm often asked is what I listened to before I listened to Bob Dylan, and I always say David Bowie, because I actually had his first 4 albums, and Tumbleweed Connection and Meaty Beaty Big and Bouncy, and that's about it. I never say the Beatles because I always forget to say them because they were just part of life when I was growing up. Everybody in Britain seemed to listen to the Beatles, and they seemed to listen to the Beatles nearly all the time. So one of my earliest memories in life is actually getting out of bed and crawling up in the middle of the night and opening the living room door and seeing people dancing. And this included my parents. I didn't believe my mother could do something like this. I suspect it was New Year in Scotland and they were dancing. And of course they were dancing to Beatles songs. And these were singles and EPs with the lovely picture covers. So I grew up playing them. They wouldn't have that many records in the house, but the Beatles were by probably about half the entire house's content of songs. So I grew up playing those. Kept those EPs for a while, but I was a DJ at Glasgow University for a Polish student event in the early 70s, and I'm afraid somebody walked away with them all, so we lost them. But my sister took me to see Hard Day's Night. I would have been either late 5 or early 6-year-old. I don't remember much about it, but it was exciting to be out without the parents, and of course it was just full of screaming girls. I was too young to actually realise how much fun that could be, unfortunately. And I got a plastic wig because when Hard Day's Night came to the Little Towns cinema, the place went even more Beatles mad, and all the kids wore plastic wigs, and my God, your head gets hot under these, I'll tell you. But for some reason we were never allowed to take them off. So I sort of grew up just accepting the Beatles and just always thinking they were there. But as I grew into a teenager, and just before I really got into Bob, actually, I kind of went mad on John Lennon. I first of all got Imagine, and then the track Mother on the Plastic Ono album just completely blew my mind. Again, one of the first times I heard Dylan's name because he's mentioned as Zimmerman there. But yeah, Lennon was a big thing to me. I really identified with him, and I used to actually carry the album Imagine into school with me. I think it probably a desperate attempt to appear cool or something. And it got me into trouble with a maths teacher who I had a bit of a fractious relationship with anyway. He came and he picked it up and he said, "Imagine John Lennon, I'd rather not." And he said it really scornfully. But I was pleased actually because I knew that John Lennon was worth a lot, and it meant that I never bothered any trouble I got from that school teacher again. So the Beatles were kind of there in that sense, but John Lennon more as I was growing up. But when I was about 18, either 18 or 21, I can't remember now, my parents, bless them, bought me the entire Beatles album collection in a big blue box. And I would periodically, through the rest of my life, just go periods of just playing it all the way through. I have these little, I go a long time without listening to the Beatles because they're always in my head. I know where they are. And then I play the albums and you realise how much better they are than in your head. There's all kinds of bits that you missed. But John Lennon had a big influence on me, and the day he was killed, I was working in a kitchen of a hotel, just cleaning dishes and things, and it came on the radio. And everybody in the hotel came up to me and said how sorry they were. And I hadn't realised then how much I was in Lennon's image, because I was dressed in faded denims. I had granny glasses, as we call them here, the John Lennon glasses. I had hair exactly the same length as Lennon had in the late 60s. And I had a peace badge on. So I was just walking around, and of course I was dazed by the news. But even in the street, people would come up to me and say how sorry they were. It was a really strange experience.
Another memory I wanted to ask about that I didn't bring up before, but it touched me deeply when you were kind enough to tell me the story. Your dad, Dylan, recorded the song "It Had to Be You" on his Sinatra album. One of the two, and I wanted to ask what the song "It Had to Be You" means to you, what memory that holds for you.
Yeah, it's a very special memory, a sad one for me. Well, quite a sad story anyway, but nice at the same time. Not my dad died quite recently, a year or so ago, and not long before he died, we were up. My wife and I were up, and as we were about to go, my dad sang "It Had to Be You" to my mum. Now he wasn't very well. He could manage about 2 lines in a chorus, and that pretty much exhausted him. But he clearly wanted to sing it to her when we were there. And so that's the last thing I heard him sing. And indeed, the next time I saw him, he couldn't really speak, far less sing. So that's one of my very last memories of him. And then not long after that, I put on a Bob Dylan album, and I hear Bob Dylan singing it. It was really amazing. He's really the two men that have, well, one's my father, obviously, and the other one is my glorious big brother. So the two men really that have brought me up, singing the same song. It was very moving.
I think I'd rather hear that one than Bob Dylan's version or Frank's version. And thank you for telling that anecdote. Hand back to Josh. I'm sorry I interjected there, but I wanted to hear that anecdote and save that one on the show. I think it's beautiful.
Well, I'd rather listen to you guys. You know more about this than I do, sir.
Yeah. Well, the thing about John Lennon and Dylan, which somebody asked earlier, it's I said they started off in adulation, but John Lennon, and he said this himself. I'm not putting I'm not sort of putting Dylan up on a pedestal and knocking John Lennon here. But John Lennon was kind of paranoid about Bob. He obviously he was the closest Beatle to him in the sense of being, a bit sarcastic, a bit aggressive. Verbal wit, but the Beatles all looked up to Bob, and John was always feeling like he didn't want to be lower than him. So there was quite a bit of sniping as well. But it went the other way when Dylan's talking to Weberman in the infamous phone call. When Dylan really gets annoyed is when Weberman says that Lennon's doing better stuff than him, and Bob just won't have that at all. So they go through life in this strange way of having these occasional snipes at each other, and then these really good things, like Lennon stood up for Dylan when Weberman was hassling him, and Bob stood up for Lennon when he was trying to get his green card. And then when Bob went Christian, Lennon. I was just going to say that Bob went electric. The Beatles all supported him. They actually were at the Royal Albert Hall supporting him. And when Bob went Christian, you would have thought this is the time where Lennon's going to really stick the knife in and go for him. But Lennon said, you let him sing what he wants. Though he went on to say that in his mind, Bob's always about don't follow leaders. He actually wasn't looking at the line, but never mind. That's what Bob was always to him. So he was surprised, but he said he should be allowed to do what he likes. Which was quite nice. Of course, back home, as we now know, because we've now got the recordings, he was actually doing quite sarcastic pastiches of Dylan's religious songs. So Dylan, the song "Got to Serve Somebody," it may be the devil, it may be the Lord, and then he was singing "Got to Serve Somebody," who may be working in Woolworths and things like that. So they had this kind of friendly rivalry all the way through. Yeah, well, I used to say that John wanted to be Bob, and I think he did. I think he's sometime in New York City is him trying to be in the early 70s what Bob was in the early 60s. So I think John wanted to be Bob, but I think George Harrison just loved Bob. I think he loved him as a person, and he obviously absolutely adored him as an artist. And they were very important for each other, I think. I still miss George, to be honest, and it was a big thing. The terrible tapes of the Beatles when they were doing "Let It Be" and all the arguments in the studio, where they cover some Dylan songs, by the way, but never mind. Moving on, George is being terribly treated by Lennon and McCartney. He's trying to get his songs, and they just want their own songs. And actually, John talks about this later, and he says, it's just human nature. John wants John songs, Paul wants Paul songs, and George wants George songs. And he says, but Paul and I were tougher, so George never got in. But it turned quite nasty. Now, at that point, despite working with Lennon and McCartney, I don't think there's any doubt that Harrison thought Bob Dylan was the best songwriter, not only alive at the moment, but that there had ever been. And of course, he played with Bob, and he co-wrote a couple of songs with Bob, and his first solo album opens with a co-written song with Bob. So I think for George Harrison to get out of this terrible situation he was in with the Beatles and to actually, writing a song with Bob Dylan, I think that really set him off confident-wise for a solo career, which could have been really difficult otherwise. And incidentally, when he went over to see Bob, they didn't play any songs for quite some time because Bob didn't, George Harrison being such a virtuoso guitar player, Bob was a bit embarrassed at his own guitar playing, so the guitars stood unused for quite a while until one day alcohol or something kicked in and the guitars came out. And of course they got on famously. And Bob then turned up at Bangladesh, which I don't think he'd have done for virtually anybody else at that time in his career, except George Harrison. Even just before it, Bob was saying, I don't think I'm going to go on. And Harrison was worried he wouldn't actually come onto the stage. But he did it, and I think he did it, just for George.
What about those Wilburys?
The Wilburys. Great fun, the Wilburys, I think. Well, Harrison, this all comes down to Harrison booking the studio, Bob's garage studio, and them playing. And I think Harrison was the driving force at the beginning. But everybody went for it, and the interactions are really interesting because Roy Orbison was delighted, that these young guys, as he put it, wanted him around. But the young guys were in awe. They'd all grown up with Roy Orbison. So, I mean, although it's amazing for us to think of a Beatle, Bob, Tom Petty and Jeff Lynne, after all they'd been through, being in awe of somebody, but they were actually in awe and just so happy to be playing with Roy Orbison. Harrison, of course, was always happy to be with Bob. I think Tom Petty pretty much is too. So they got on. It's not the greatest music of all time, I don't think, but it's great fun, and I think it was really important for Bob. He was in a very bad way in the 80s. Things weren't going well. His sales were abysmal. And the Travelling Wilburys sold really well. And there's good fun. And I think in the second album, unfortunately, with Roy Orbison passing away, in the second album more attention went on to Bob, which made the album less poppy and less popular. But Bob's contributions are excellent. Actually, I think Bob's contributions are excellent in both albums, but you might think I'm a little bit biased.
Meeting the Beatles, and our friend Brooke Halpern will be on next week. He does the Come Together with the Beatles with Brooke show, and it's always funny. He does Beatles trivia. But I wanted to ask Andy what he wrote on one of my favorite pages. He's been kind of kind to nice articles too to put out, but I'm so excited when the first one came in, I'd be embarrassed to read. Tell me about Expecting Rain.
Oh, I love Expecting Rain. Expecting Rain, so www.expectingrain.com. Expecting Rain, all one word, lowercase. It's been over 20 years now. It's just the go-to morning page for Dylan fans. It's run by somebody called Carl Erik Andersen from Norway. A lovely fellow. Everybody's got kind words to say about him, which is not always true in the Dylan world. He runs this site and he puts up links to every news item on Dylan every day. And also related stuff, stuff on the Beatles, stuff on Neil Young, mainly Bob, but Bob related and, our general culture. And it's been going a long, long time, and going back in the days when I used to run fanzines, I used to run an information line, as I mentioned, and I could tell that people were getting to work across the world because it was long distance calls, obviously, if you didn't living in the UK, and the machine would click when somebody called, and there would these be rush of clicks, and I would say, oh yeah, that's the east coast of America getting to work, and work its way over to the west coast, that's Australia wakening up. And it's a similar thing with this site. I think most Dylan fans click on it first thing in the morning and check what's happening. It grew up, I go back a long way, I'm afraid, Bob, so I go back before the internet, so it was one of the first internet sites. It must have been around about the time of World Gone Wrong. I'm doing it by Dylan albums and the operating system I was using. I was in Windows 3.1. It would be around about then, and it grew out of earlier groups. We had a group called rec.music.dylan, which was a Usenet group. You didn't have browsers and graphics in those days, and there were things called Dylan Atlas and Who's Who. They were definitely on Expecting Rain at the beginning. So it's over 20 years now, and over 10 years ago they started putting on forums. So there's discussion forums. You used to go into discussion forum and you were welcomed by a lovely lady called Janice O'Hara, though her name there was Boston area Bob fan. That's how I knew her. And she unfortunately passed away in January this year. I wanted to mention her. She always gave people a warm welcome to the site. So there's forums there. There's music to be downloaded and all kinds of other forums. But it's the daily news that dominates. And as you say, Carol's a really helpful person. I'm glad you mentioned that. That's really good.
Well, Dylan said don't look back, but I want to say to you, please come back because I have many more questions for you.